In a recent video that I posted, I looked at the probability of a team winning the NCAA National Basketball Tournament given its seed in the tournament. And we had a lot of fun doing that and made some interesting conclusions about which seeds have been overperforming and underperforming and everything like that. What I want to do in this video, my next video in the series of creating the best tournament brackets, is a team's chance of winning the Big Ten men's basketball tournament given its seed. The reason I want to look at that is because the Big Ten has an interesting tournament setup for its 14 teams, and I wonder what kind of effect is that going to have on the probability of teams advancing, and can we apply the same type of analysis that we use for the NCAA tournament to look at the probability of winning the Big Ten basketball tournament. Before we start, let's look at the breakdown for how the Big Ten tournament works. Big Ten has a 14-team tournament, and you could set up a 14-team tournament as a 16-team single elimination tournament with 2 byes on the 1 and 2 teams getting by. But this isn't what the Big Ten does. What the Big Ten does is effectively it's a 12-team single elimination tournament with 2 play-in games. The bottom 4 seeds, 11 through 14, have to play in order to make it into the top 12, and then there's a single elimination tournament from there. So here's our bottom 4 seeds, so 12 versus 13, 11 versus 14, and then the winner of 12-13 goes on to face number 5. The winner of 11-14 goes on to face number 6, as one would expect. So 11 versus 6 is what we would expect in that bracket setup. Once you get past that preliminary round, now you have effectively a 12-team single elimination tournament. And the way this is set up is basically you set up a 16-team single elimination tournament. You give the top 4 seeds byes into the second round. So here is 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see it's set up 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3, and all the matchups are as you would expect in a 12-team single elimination tournament. But I just wondered, because of this 12-team bracket and with the 2 playing games, I just wondered how this would work in terms of winning the national title. Actually, it's interesting, if you go back and look at the history before, in 2014 or so, I think they only had a 12-team tournament. And I think that's because what they did is they just eliminated the bottom 2, that the bottom 2 didn't actually make the conference tournament. And then they had a 12-team tournament without that. But then they added in 2015 or so, they added the 2 play-in games. And so in my work, what I've looked at is the era of the 14-team tournament. The analysis that we're going to use for this is similar to what we use for the NCAA tournament. When this is going to rely very heavily on the discussion that we had in the NCAA tournament video. So if you haven't seen that video, now is the time to actually check that out. There's a lot of information in there that we're going to refer to in the course of this discussion. As with the NCAA video, the way we're going to think about the probability of winning the Big Ten tournament is we're going to treat each game by using this integrated normal distribution as our probability function. Just a reminder, what that says is that the probability of a team winning in a given game is given by how much better they are than the other team that they're playing. And so, for example, if the teams are equal in quality, which is right here, then the probability that either team is going to win is going to be 50-50. If their teams are equal, you can't tell which team is going to win. As one team gets much better than the other one, the probability of that team winning gets closer to 100%. Conversely, if a team is much worse than the other one, then the probability of that team winning goes down asymptotically toward 0%. And the in between, the function that we use to describe this is just an integrated normal distribution. There are multiple probability functions that have been applied in these types of situations. I like the integrated normal distribution because I'm familiar with it. It works pretty well. We showed in the NCAA video that when applied to seeds, that the integrated normal distribution actually worked very well at describing the win probability for head-to-head matchups between different seeds in the NCAA tournament. And the other advantage of an integrated normal distribution, it's a built-in function in all statistical programs. And so something like Excel is real easy to use an integrated normal distribution to calculate probabilities. And so that's what I do in my work. The challenge in using this type of integrated normal distribution is defining this coordinate here of how much better you are than the other team. What we did in the NCAA analysis is we used seeds as a proxy for how good the teams actually are relatively. It's not really how good they are, but at least how good the committee thinks they are. But that's what we used as the parameters for this axis down here, how much better you are than the other team. And then what we did was we looked at head-to-head matchups between different seeds, and we could calculate the probability of a 1 seed beating a 7 seed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I've done the same thing for the Big Ten tournament. I've looked at the outcome of head-to-head matchups of all seeds. The problem that we have in the Big Ten tournament is that we've only got 8 years worth of data. When I did the NCAA tournament, I was looking at 20 years worth of data. Each tournament had 4 different regions that had matchups between the seeds in 1 through 16. And so there were a lot of data points that we could use for that. And one of the main conclusions that we used when we did the NCAA analysis is that we could use head-to-head winning percentages if there are at least 10 head-to-head matchups, and even 10 was very light. We got a lot better data when we had more like 20 or 30 head-to-head matchups that we could examine. When it comes to the Big Ten tournament, we've only got 8 years worth of data, and so at most there's 8 games between seeds in the tournament. And this just isn't enough data in order to get a reliable win-loss percentage. I mean, we can look at the win-loss percentage. Here is the number 1 seed versus everybody else. Unlike NCAA tournament, one number 1 seed's never matched against another number 1 seed. There's only one number 1 seed in the tournament. Interestingly, in the 8 years of the Big Ten tournament, there's never been a 1 versus 2 matchup. 1 versus 3, 1 versus 4, 1 is undefeated against 3 and 4, and 1 is winless against the 5th seed, 2 and 2 against the 8 seeds, 3 and 1 against the 9 seeds, etc. And you can look at this by seed, and you can see the A seed versus all these other things. 8 versus 9 is a 4-4, which is about what we'd expect for something like that. But there's just not enough data here in order to calculate winning percentages that I could model like we could do with the NCAA tournament. In this analysis, I've taken a different type of an approach. Instead of looking at individual head-to-head outcomes, what I'm going to look at is gross advancement data. So for example, let's look at how teams have been successful in advancing rounds. If you win the first round, those playing games, and you make it into round 2, and we can look at how many of the teams have made it into round 2, 5 number 11 seeds, 2 12 seeds, 6 13 seeds, 3 14 seeds. And remember, these are playing games, and so 11 versus 14 is 5 and 3. 12 versus 13, actually 12 is way underperforming, and we'll get back and talk about that a little bit later. And then we can look at the number of teams that advance to the quarterfinals. I'm sorry, this table's off a little bit here, but these are the teams that advance into the quarterfinals. Remember, 1, 2, 3, and 4 all make the quarterfinals because they have byes over the 8 years. 4 number 5 seeds, 5 number 6 seeds, 6 number 7 seeds have made the quarterfinals. Then we can look into see who all makes the semifinals. 5 number 1 seeds have made the semifinals. So 3 number 1 seeds have lost in their first round of the Big Ten tournament. Number 3 seeds are 7 and 1. You can look at this entire distribution down here. We can look at the distribution of teams that make the finals and then the teams that make the championship. One of the things we discovered in the NCAA analysis is that if you look at the bottom group of seeds, none of these might be predicted to make it into whatever round we're talking about. However, If you look at the group of them, then you can sometimes see that they add up to have enough probability to make it into that position. So for example, if you look at the probability the 11, 12, 13, 14 seeds make it into the semifinals, you will see none of them are predicted to ever make it, or the expected number of semifinals for 11, 12, 13, or 14 in 8 years are all going to be zero. But if you sum up the probability of 11, 12, 13, and 14, then you find out that there is this, they expect at least one team seeded 11 through 14 to make the semifinals over 8 years. And so what I've done in this analysis, I've actually binned up the bottom four for the semifinals and the finals. And in fact, for the championship, I binned up the bottom seven and put those all together into one bin so that we can compare them that way. So ultimately, what I'm doing in this work is, instead of looking at individual head-to-head matchup in terms of seeds, what I'm going to do is I'm going to optimize the probability of head-to-head matchups between teams so to maximize the agreement with this distribution of results. So I'm going to try to do it so that I have a probability that we get three number one seeds winning the championship, and overall we're going to try to match this distribution that I have. This is going to be an alternate approach instead of the head-to-head matchup. I think we're going to find that it's pretty legit because it's giving us results that look fairly reasonable, especially if you put some constraints on the analysis. It's coming out not too far off of what we would expect. And so I think this is a reasonable approach for optimizing probability. When it comes to these seeds, we've got to make some assumptions, and that's important here. An unstated assumption on the seeds that we had for the NCAA tournament is that in general the seeds were about right, or at least the relative seeds were right, and any variation that we had at that point was just noise due to small sample size. And that made some sense because the seeds for the NCAA tournament are determined by the committee, and so even though the seeds might not be an exact representation of team quality, at least the seeds are a representation of how good the committee thinks the team is. And that's a pretty good start. It takes into account win-loss record and strength of schedule and things like that. Maybe it's overly weighted on something like RPI, which is not good for seeding, although I think the NCAA basketball committee does rely on other types of parameters like Sagarin or KenPom or something like that, and they can use those in informing their seeding that they have. And so our assumption on the NCAA tournament with the seeds, relative seeds, were pretty reliable. I'm not sure we can say that about the Big Ten tournament. Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. In one respect, the Big Ten tournament has an advantage because the seeds are based objectively, and the seeds are based on their regular season conference record. So the team with the best regular season record, the regular season conference championship, is given the number one seed, and it's based on records with various tiebreakers along the way. The problem with this type of an approach, though, is that even though it's all conference games, even within the conference, the Big Ten is too big this year so that teams don't actually play balanced schedules. This would work a lot better if we had, a double round robin conference schedule, but they don't do that in the Big Ten because it's too big. Because you don't have balanced schedules, seeds based on win-loss records might not be perfectly accurate. So there are a couple of different assumptions that we could use to interpret the seeds of the Big Ten tournament, and I've considered all of these different assumptions when I've carried out the analysis, and we'll talk about that as we go. But first of all, you could just take the approach that we took for the NCAA tournament and say, hey, the relative seeds are correct, and the variation in the win-loss records head-to-head is just due to small samples, and it definitely is very small samples. So maybe that's what it comes down to. So we could impose that criteria that the relative seeds are correct, and there's some variation in relative differences, but as long as the relative seeds are are held in place. A second approach we could say is that, well, the relative seeds are mostly correct, but what if there's some that are off? I mentioned the 12 versus 13, that the 13 seed is 6-2 against the 12 seed. Is that really because on the whole, the 12 and 13 seeds just aren't very well done? And this could have to do versus Big Ten East versus Big Ten West and something like that, ranking that within those different subgroups. And so maybe we could just take the relative seeds and then correct some of the most blatant violators. And so we could try something like that. We could take an approach that says the seeds are pretty close, but they could be off a few places. And so maybe the number 3 seed is not really number 3, it's actually number 5, but just because of the quirk of the schedule that it ended up finishing in 3rd or something like that. And I think this is the one that we're going to come back to in a little bit, but this is another way to do it so that there's some variation in the seeds and let them poodle around a little bit, move a couple places here and there. Or you could just say that the seeds really don't mean anything, and let's not rely on the seeds, and let's optimize everybody's results and see what the effective seeds really are. Maybe we should just not take the seeds worth anything and figure out what positions just end up better. So these are 4 different assumptions that we could use to interpret the seeds. In this work, the main analysis we're going to do is going to be this version here, that the seeds are pretty close, but could be off by a few places. So what we're going to do is we're going to let the seeds vary as we do the optimization, but we're not going to let them vary all over the place. We're not going to let the 13 seed move up and be the number 3 seed instead. We'll let it move up to maybe 9 or something like that, and we'll let the 6 seed drop down to 10 and let some little shuffling happening, but nothing dramatic or completely out of control. This is the approach that we're going to use in this analysis. So this slide shows the optimized probabilities of each seed beating another seed, given that assumption of the seeds that allow them to vary a little bit from within their assigned values. And so what you can see here is the probability of the seeds along the top beating the seeds as you go down. And so we know that a 1 seed were to face another 1 seed, the probability would be 50%, and that's exactly what we have here. The probability of 1 beating 2 is more like 55. 1 beating 3, you can see that 2 and 3 are off a little bit here, so 3 is a little bit better than 2 coming out. And so the probability of a 1 beating a 3 is more like 54%, 1 beating 8, 66%, 1 beating 11, 83%. The worst team in terms of the outcomes that we've seen so far are the 12 seeds, and we saw that they are way underperforming, and so they end up being the weakest team overall. And we predict a 1 versus 12 probability of something like 92%. And you can look at this entire table to see, given your seed in the tournament, what's your probability of beating the team that you're going up against. So the 13 seed versus a 12 seed has a 77% probability of winning, which is right on the 6-2 that we'd expect. 11 versus 14 is 60%, and that's exactly what it is in terms of the measured outcome. So you can see that the probabilities are reflecting the things that we know, at least in those respects. Maybe it's overweighted toward those outcomes, I don't know, but at least there's 8 games there as opposed to fewer. One thing that you want to look at in this breakdown is how much have the seeds changed from their actual numbering. And what I've done on this little graph here is if they have a seed, this is what they are seeded in the tournament, and these numbers over here is what they act like in the tournament, how they've performed. And most of the times they're in pretty good places. You know, the number 1 seed has been the best team in terms of performance. The number 2 and number 3 teams are flipped. We saw that. 4 is more like a 6. 5 is more like a 4. 6 seeds actually have been way underperforming, and so they're way down at 10. And it's the 13 seeds that are way overperforming, acting more like the 9th seed. But you can see there's a pretty good correlation here, that there's they're pretty similar to what they've been seeded with some little modifications along the way. All right, so back to this global probabilities. What we want to do is take these probabilities and put them into the single elimination tournament that I showed you before and calculate the probability of a team advancing given its seed. And so we can absolutely do that. Here are the probabilities of advancing in the Big Ten tournament given your seeds, and using this assumption that the seeds are variable within a small degree. Rounds 1 and 2, you can see the teams that get byes are given 100% probability or probability of 1 of advancing into that round. And then you can look at the outcomes for all the other ones. And so here's the probability of 11 through 14 advancing into round 2. Here's the probability that teams advance into the quarterfinal. Here's the probability, and this is where it all gets real. This is the probability of teams advancing into the semifinal. Remember, there were more number 3 seeds that made it to the semis than there were number 1s, and this is reflected in the fact that and in the terms of the probability. So the matchup between 3 and, well, whatever, team 6 or whatever is more lopsided than the probability between 1 and 8 or 9. And you can see that reflected in these probabilities here. This is the probability that the team makes it into the final game, and this is the probability that the team wins the Big Ten championship. Remember, these data are obtained by trying to optimize probabilities toward minimizing the deviation between the outcomes versus the distribution that we've seen. If you look at, for example, the championship, the probability of the number 1 seed winning the championship is about 25%. That means that over those 8 years, we should have expected only 2 number 1 seeds to win the championship. The actual number has been 3, and so we're a little bit low here, but on the other hand, we're a little bit overrepresented when it comes to things like semifinal and final type representations, and so all those things have to come into play when we do this analysis. So this is the probability of teams winning the Big Ten championship. Hey, if you're a number 7 seed, you have a 7% chance of winning the Big Ten championship. There you go. I should worth mentioning, a number 7 seed has won the Big Ten championship over the years. Notice that the probability does not just mirror the seeds. That's because, as far as we can tell, effectively the seeds are not well represented by their actual numbers, and so this is effectively what the seeds have performed. And yeah, it's true, the number 5 seed has a better chance of winning the tournament than the number 4 seed. That's just the way that the number 5 seeds have performed in the Big Ten tournament so far. If we had more data, maybe I could go back and look at the 12-team tournaments and use that data in terms of the analysis as well. It's possible. It's actually not hard to do, to add that in there. Maybe I'll see what happens. If it makes a big difference, hey, we could update this as we go along. We can look at other variations on the theme that I just talked about. For example, what if we did assume that the relative seeds are correct? And then what happens to the probabilities? And I'm just going to look at the probability of the championship. It doesn't affect the probability of the number 1 team winning. It's only about 25%, still only 25%. It does affect the outcomes for all these other parameters here. Even at this one, the number 2 and number 3 seeds have only about the same probability of winning the championship. That has to do with the fact that even though I've imposed relative positioning of the seeds to be the same, I've allowed some variation in the differences between seeds. And so the difference between a 5 and a 6 might be very small, but the difference between 7 and 8 might be very big. And that can lead to differences in these types of outcomes as well. On the other hand, there's not a lot of difference here. And I think that the differences are too small to actually worry too much about. Here's a new model where we assume the seeds are mostly correct with only some variation. So in this case, I think the only thing I've done is I've changed the probability for the 12 and 13. Other than that, I've kept the relative seeds all the same and only modified this one. And now we do have an ordering of probability 1 through, well, at least through 12, because this is going to be the lowest seeded team overall because of the performance of it. Or we could assume that the seeds are completely not reliable. And in this case, it comes out a little bit better because now probability of the number 1 seed winning the championship is like more like 3/8. And so if you take that over the 8 years, we would expect 3 of the champions to be number 1 seeds exactly as it was. It comes off a little bit with the number 2 and number 3 seeds and stuff like that. 2 seeds are underrepresented in the championship. They're overrepresented. 3 seeds are overrepresented elsewhere, but underrepresented in the championship. Overall, this is the model that gives the best overall agreement with the actual distribution, which is not surprised because I had the most free parameters. This is actually a 15 variable fit. Completely unconstrained 15 variables is going to give you the best fit to the data. It's not necessarily going to be realistic though, because if you look at the relative seeds on this, the number 13 seed ends up being treated like a number 3 seed or something like that. The relative rating of the number 13 seed comes up very, very high. And I didn't think that was as realistic as what we would see otherwise. And there was some correlation between the probabilities here and the seeds, but it wasn't very, very high. And so I didn't think that was as realistic. I think the seeds are better than what this model gives in that way. So back to the model that I think is best. This is the probability of your teams advancing to within the Big Ten tournament, assuming that the seeds are variable within 4. So this would be the table that I think you should use to look at the probability of your team advancing once you know your seed in the Big Ten tournament. You can look at the probability of advancing into the second round, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, and into the championship. What do we conclude? Just like we saw with the NCAA men's basketball tournament, I think it's possible to model the outcomes of these Big Ten tournament by considering the win probability based on seeds. More data would be very helpful. We don't have enough head-to-head data to create a good probability surface, but we can actually create a pretty good probability model by looking at just the distribution of outcomes. Again, more data would be helpful. And I'm going to continue to look into the outcomes. As I'm recording this, the Big Ten tournament starts in about a week, so we can look at the outcome for 2024 and see how that contributes to the model to make it better or worse. One thing that's been very difficult with a Big Ten analysis is that the seeds are not necessarily good proxies for team quality for whatever reason that is. So we've had to be willing to tweak the seeds of the teams in order to get better fit to the data. Is that due to the fact that the seeds are poor, or is it due to the fact that the data is poor? It's probably a combination of both. But for now, what we have, given the data we have, this is the best that we can do. What we've learned from this, and if you go back and look at the outcomes that we have, is that the number 5 and the number 13 seeds have been the teams that have overperformed in the Big Ten tournament, whereas it's the 6 and the 12 seeds have been the ones that have underperformed in the Big Ten tournament. As I said, we can keep an eye on that, what happens as we go forward. We're going to see what happens next week in the 2024 tournament, but this is what we've learned from the past 8 seasons of the Big Ten tournament. As always, like and subscribe. You don't have to subscribe. Like this video, comment on this video if you have anything to contribute, and if you can think of anything else you would like me to do in terms of analyzing tournament brackets, any existing tournaments, or anything about tournament setup, leave me a comment and tell me what we can do. I'm always looking for suggestions of what to do next.